Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Warcraft video. So, how about that patch 7.3 ending? Well, it's not really the ending, but it is the conclusion of the patch 7.3 questing content, and of course do bear in mind the raid will cover a lot of lore, and Blizzard did say there'd likely be a small patch in the future. Whether they were talking about patch 7.3.5 or something else does of course remain to be seen. Now, not only did we get to see Ilaria dabble in the Void, we got to see her fully embrace it, almost by accident at the end, and the events of this patch have really given us a lot of interesting lore to talk about, especially with how it could relate to a future expansion. One thing that I do want to point out before getting into all of this though, is that this patch brought in new ethereal models. Now if you think back to patch 6.2 of Warlords of Draenor, it brought a whole bunch of new demon models that existed because of Legion's development. So it seems quite likely that we will see the Ethereals play a role in the future, and I mean that, like, it's pretty unlikely for Blizzard to just redo a race only to be used in a single patch. But with that said, let's get right into the lore. Shadow and Light have been a major theme of this patch in two key areas. First, the Illidan prophecy, and second, the contrast between Illyria and Turalyon. Now, before we talk about the characters, what do we actually know about the Light and the Void? Well, basically, they are responsible for the creation of the universe. The Warcraft version of the Big Bang is pretty much the result of light and void colliding, with that collision leading to all that we see in the universe. These seem to be the most fundamental forces that we know of, with other things such as arcane and fel coming afterwards as the universe formed. Some forces like fel and arcane are separate but opposing things, with say the battles between the Titans, who are arcane beings, and demons being fel beings, making a lot of sense there. The Light and Void seem different from those forces though. While they are, yes, opposing forces, they are also dependent on each other. As Illyria says in the patch,
"Without the light, there is no shadow, teacher."
What's interesting to me is the Naru parallel. While they are beings formed of light, they are able to turn into void beings, which does suggest that light and void are different configurations of the same stuff. I have to wonder if a Naru is kind of the light default. Of course, do remember Dark Naru are very rare, but if that is the case, what is the void default? Is it a Void Lord? But, I mean, the Void Lords that Sargeras were scared of, they seem to be a power level above the Naru, so it's hard to know. But overall, yeah, what is the Void equivalent of a Naru? Is there one? And, you know, is there a creature where, much like how a Naru can turn into its Void state, is there a creature that defaults to Void but can turn into a light state very rarely? Who knows? And then on top of that, is there a light equivalent to a Void Lord? Maybe a Loon is what that is? Hard to know. Currently, we just don't know how deep the idea of them sort of being the same thing, essentially. We don't know how deep that sort of thing goes, but Illyria does at least hint that it is the case. Another theme of this patch has been questioning what we thought about these fundamental forces. The Light was shown to be morally dubious, with Xera's disregard for Illidan as an individual. This really showed us that the Light is not some sort of pure force for good. We then see Illyria, a friendly character, embrace the Void as a tool, being able to use it supposedly for good. Now, this once again makes these forces sort of look like sides of a coin, perhaps with the Void side of things maybe just being inherently super addictive, almost like it's sort of like a souped up force with a light and a dark side. Do remember that adherence to the light, it does not mean that someone is good. After all, the light could be fully wielded by the Scarlet Crusade, and they use the light to commit atrocities. So again, it definitely is morally dubious. Now, speaking of the old lore, it is worth mentioning that the old stuff will need to be taken with a grain of salt. Much of the Void lore from the Burning Crusade, and perhaps our thoughts of the Naru from back then, they do need to be called into question. They've already, you know, sort of sneaked around like Illidan's handling in that expansion, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see Blizzard's idea of light and the Void vary from the Burning Crusade days. After all, during the Burning Crusade, the entire cosmic picture of Warcraft was very different from what it is today, or at least just wasn't at all fleshed out. So now that everything that you thought was true has been messed with, Let's talk about characters. Illyria Windrunner was perhaps the most interesting one, and the finale of the 7.3 story very much is following her interest in mastering void energy. While scouting out the area, we run into Locust Walker, who is Illyria's mentor in void-related matters. While we aren't sure when they met, it does seem like they have known each other for quite a time. Illyria has already been dabbling in void power as of the start of patch 7.3, as evidenced by her talking about her past imprisonment by Zira. As we soon see, she advances from dabbling in the void energy to sort of more advanced uses of it. Really the kind of uses that normally cause beings to lose their minds, as we saw with Arkan. Now, the Locust Walker seems to be on her side, but he does question Turalyon. The Locust Walker is probably skeptical of the light, and maybe he understates the downsides of the void. As we know, Illyria does understand that the light and void need each other to exist, and she is happy to be the shadow to Turalyon's light. So to speak anyway. Now, after absorbing the core of Nalatoth, Illyria sort of seemed very confident in her newfound mastery of the void, mastery which she then brings to bear as we confront the fallen Naru Lura in the seat of the Triumvirate. This is where things get interesting. Illyria seems to have gotten in over her head. While she does seem confident during the fight, look at her face in that cinematic. That is not the face of someone whose plan is going smoothly. The core of the Naru crashes into her and Illyria stands up, in full void form, skin dark purple, eyes glowing blue, almost sucking in light, just like an ethereal. You've got to wonder what the ethereals looked like before they were washed with the void. Maybe we'll find that out someday. But here's where we run into a problem. The story ends with the most minimal of explanations. If you want to hear me get triggered about Blizzard's storytelling, do hit up the SoundCloud in the description, by the way. But after that cinematic, we see Illyria in the dungeon in her full void form. Then she, along with Locust Walker, just walk into a void portal and disappear. Now, there are actually lines of dialogue that play there in-game, but they either don't trigger for everyone, or they play out during the cinematic, so that if you watch the cinematic, you miss the dialogue. So hats off to you, Blizzard, for that execution. But in this dialogue, they say that they need to test the limits of her new power. We then make our way back to the Vindicar, and Illyria appears. In her normal green armor, no hint of all this void stuff. So, after going through that portal, she must have done something with Locust Walker. Now, on the Vindicar, she does have some dialogue giving her perspective on the Lura encounter. It's decently revealing. So she talks about how others fear the void and how she thinks that she is the same person but somehow is more after her experience. Now, we are assured that it's all under control, but I have to imagine that generally everything's under control until it very suddenly isn't. Illyria talks of Lura, a being of light turned to shadow, and how that felt familiar. This might be to do with her backstory after many of her family were killed during the Second War. And if you want to see more about that, you can check out my Illyria and Turalyon primer video that I did that covers the whole story of them. But anyway, would she turn evil? Well, if the light and void are sides of a coin, then I think that'll lead to her being a good character, operating alongside Turalyon as the shadow and the light, perhaps even fulfilling a bit of that role that was meant in the prophecy for Illidan. Now, I don't think that Blizzard will have her turn evil, honestly. Partially that's because at this stage they must be hyper aware of how many of their characters just get corrupt. Illidan is basically Kerrigan, with the only difference being that they make a different decision at one of the endpoints of their arc. It would be a shame if Illyria ended up being the same. Now, Xal'atath does take keen interest in her, saying this:
"The caterpillar has become the butterfly. She is all but ours now."
Which really does not sound good at all. Yeah, I really hope that we do see a lot more of her in the future, though. She seems like one of the more interesting characters in the current roster. There's a bit of conflict there, there's room for growth, and in terms of dramatic potential, there could be some great character development that happens with her, and Turalyon especially. I think that could be very cool, so I hope we see that in the future. Okay, on to Locust Walker. He is an intriguing fellow, very much on the grey side of things morally, it would seem, with a voice that's very calm and detached, which makes him seem trustworthy but also masterful at what he does. But Xal'atath does not think so. Xal'atath says this about him:
"He flaunts his defiance of the shadows. Arrogance will be his undoing.
And that does suggest that he genuinely thinks he's a master of the void, but that it really could crumble as time goes on. Overall, I could see the Locust Walker being on our side initially and then betraying us, and this would lead to some good interactions with his apprentice, Illyria, so I could see that potentially happening. Now, over on the Vindicar, Vashreen says that Locust Walker is disreputable, and that Locust Walker didn't repay Vashreen after he funded one of Locust Walker's projects. So of course, Locust Walker isn't his real name, that's one thing we know. We also don't know how he mastered the void energies, but he hinted that we may find out eventually. Overall, there's room to grow with him. Now then, the Ethereals. Well, it seems like these guys could make their way back into the game at some point based on how Blizzard just redid their art, something which takes quite a lot of time and probably isn't worth doing just for a single patch. Ethereals are a very interesting race. Their lore is something that I've covered before, but a key thing in their structure is that they have many factions under trade princes, that includes void ones and non-void ones. Naturally, they should be enemies of the void given how it destroyed their homeworld, so I could see overall us having both friendly and hostile Ethereals in the future of the game. I did notice that a few of them are wearing more regular clothes from an art perspective, so I do wonder if they'd ever be playable, though that seems very hard to implement, and that could just be my personal leanings speaking out, because I think they're really cool. Okay, we've talked a lot about Void stuff, let's talk about the Legion. So, we finally unlocked the full power of the Vindicar after collecting the various Triumvirate artifacts, and presumably we're ready to properly take the fight to them on Antorus. Our Legion story ended with Velen defeating Talgath, and not much more. It seems like we definitely have to wait until Antorus to get the full Legion side of the story for this patch, with what we really saw here maybe setting up some future plot lines. So what's my take from all of this? Well, I think it's pretty clear where the next expansion is going, and that Illyria is going to be a core character, with the theme of shadow and light also likely playing a big role in the game, of course, because the next big threat is not the Burning Legion, it is the Void. Overall, a very cool setup for the future, and that really is my take on things. What I'm more interested in is, now that you have played all 3 weeks of the content, what do you think about the story? Also, what do you think about the next expansion? Because, you know, if we are doing an Old God Azeroth-based expansion, you do wonder how much they would, like, you know, how sci-fi they get with that, because the Ethereals are a little bit sci-fi. Maybe the old gods could summon in the Ethereals, but that seems a bit weird because the Ethereals seem to almost be too smart for the old gods in a way. Like, the old gods seem to prey on manipulation and people who don't understand things, but now that we've all been to space and we've all seen the greater picture, it's hard to know how the old gods would really fit in there, because surely we're all, well, very smart now. So I'm definitely keen to see what you think about where the game could be going. But that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.